I want to talk about what to talk about on your podcast. And you can think about, okay, I want to go out there and I want to have a podcast, but what do I talk about? What content am I going to be wanting to share? So I think there's a couple of different ways that you can go about this. One is having guest interviews. I find for my own podcast, having guests is super helpful. It makes the process a lot easier when just trying to figure out what to talk about on my podcast with by having these guests. So I'll prep for the interview, and maybe I'm bringing on a multifamily investor, and I'm talking about how do they get started in real estate, and then I'm talking about where they're investing, talking about the deals that they've done, successes, failures, different things like that. So I like to bring on guests for my podcast. I find that they really help carry the conversation. You can be conversational to a point where a lot of times I'm just asking questions and they'll spend a couple of minutes just going over the answers. And then based on what they say, I'll have more questions or I'll want to make a comment about it for another minute or two. So I find having guests on my podcast is definitely helpful. I would say current events, something that you can do in your sector and something that I do. I have Google Alerts set up for real estate investing. So I see all the different alerts about once a day of all the top stories within the real estate investing space. And if you're in the oil and gas space, if you're in a different alternative investment class or totally a different business, I'd recommend setting up these Google alerts. They're fairly easy to set up. You can also subscribe to industry leading news. So two things that I use are two subscriptions. I have one to the Wall Street Journal, obviously not 100% about real estate, but does have relevant topics in there. And then I also subscribe to I believe it's called The Real Deal, which is more on your real estate aspect. And it's a mixture of both investing and then also for agents and brokerages and different things like that as well. But they have a lot of current events that I could pull from. Not that I do that, but as an example, I would be able to pull content from those two avenues. The third one would be educational content, and educational content is like this interview, is this podcast if you're listening to it, or this YouTube video if you're watching it. And I'm just trying to provide content, trying to provide and be helpful. Obviously, in this one, I'm talking about what to talk about on your podcast, ideas what to talk about on your podcast to just help you out. And this is just educational content. And what I do to help find content for me is I'll use two tools. One, I believe it's Answer the Public. So I'll type in podcasting, podcast guesting, see what people are typing, see what people are searching for. And I'll look at the questions that people are asking. So, like a question that had a lot of traffic volume that people are talking about was, what do I talk about on my podcast? So I figured, why not record an episode of what to talk about on your podcast? So it was pretty helpful. Another tool I use is called SpyFu, SPYFU, I believe is the name, and that can do a lot of PPC, if I could say, if I get that out correctly. Yeah, PPC performance, SEO performance, just different things like that, and it'll give you questions. And I can type in podcast guesting. It'll show me what people are searching for. Very comparative to Answer the Public. I believe it's Answer the Public and not Ask the Public, but very comparative. And it just gives me tons of content for educational content for me to go out there and use to create episodes like you're listening today. And then the next one would be behind the scenes. If you're going out there and building a business, maybe you talk about you're doing a recap of what's working with you, what you're doing, what books you're reading, how you're growing the business, what you're seeing in the business, the challenges that you're facing in the business. If you're an investor, you're talking about different deals that you have going on, deals that are successful, deals that aren't going as well as you would have liked, deals that you have coming up on the horizon. I mean, there's really any number of content and topics that you could talk about on your podcast. I find that what worked best for me was just getting started, putting together topics, just talking about those topics. And then over time, I became more efficient at the topics. I would get different ideas. Oh, I want to talk about that. Oh, I saw that story. And it just becomes the more practice you have on your podcast interviews, the better off you're going to be and the easier it's going to become thinking about what to talk about on your podcast. But I hope that was very helpful. I know it's short. Hopefully it was sweet. And then I hope everyone got some value out of today's episode. I hope everyone has a good rest of the day and keep going and keep crushing it out there.